It didn't start quietly. It started with a shockwave, a barrage of executive orders, mass firings, entire agencies gutted overnight. The goal wasn't subtlety, it was overload. Bannon's muzzle velocity strategy was in full effect. Fire off so many rapid high-impact disruptions that the sheer chaos would keep opposition scrambling, unable to focus on what truly mattered. While the media chased the spectacle of each new purge, the real operation unfolded beneath the noise. A systematic dismantling of the intelligence and security state, severing its deepest roots before anyone could mount a meaningful defense. The first real sign of collapse wasn't the intelligence agencies. It was the foundation beneath them. US aid, America's soft power machine, dissolved overnight and absorbed into the State Department. The Office of Personnel Management, the backbone of federal hiring, was next. Musk's aides physically seized OPM headquarters, barring senior civil servants from systems they had been running just days before. The message was clear. The government no longer controlled its own workforce. Those who hired, those who promoted, those who granted clearances, none of them had access anymore. The hiring pipeline for every future intelligence officer had been severed. Then came the FBI. At first it was a slow bleed, a few resignations, a few early retirements. Then, entire divisions were wiped out overnight. Analysts found themselves locked out of classified networks. Agents were handed severance packages that felt more like surrender terms. The federal law enforcement apparatus, the domestic immune system of the intelligence world, had been deactivated. A country that had spent decades building a surveillance state suddenly found itself blind, deaf, and stripped of its own police force. And then, the email. A message landed in the inboxes of CIA operatives across the world. The body was short, an offer, a severance package, a decision to make. Those who accepted would walk away with 8 months of pay and a full benefits package. Those who stayed had no guarantee of anything, except that the agency they had known was gone. The subject line was mocking one Musk had used before. Fork in the road. The Central Intelligence Agency has never been interested in mere intelligence. Surveillance, counterintelligence, espionage, these were tools, not objectives. The real goal was always control. For most of its history, control meant shaping the external world. Governments, economies, revolutions, the flow of information, power was a game of influence, played on maps and in war rooms. But in the late 20th century, something changed. A radical question emerged within the agency, a challenge to its entire framework of dominance. What if control didn't need to be exerted externally? What if it could happen at the level of perception itself? That question was not born in Washington, but in a research lab in Virginia. In the 1970s, a team working with the Monroe Institute began experiments on a method they called hemi-sync. Using precise audio frequencies, they discovered they could induce altered states of awareness, synchronizing the hemispheres of the brain to achieve what could only be described as expanded perception. Test subjects reported strange phenomena, sensations of floating outside their bodies, visions of distant places, knowledge of things they should not have known. The deeper they went, the more impossible the reports became. The CIA took notice. The agency had dabbled in the fringes of consciousness research before: psychic warfare, remote viewing, the effects of LSD on perception. But this was different. This was not a chemical hack, nor a wild-eyed paranormal theory. This was structured, repeatable, operational. What had started as an obscure neurological curiosity became, in the hands of intelligence operatives, Project Gateway, an attempt to weaponize the mind itself. The program's findings shattered the traditional understanding of human perception. Controlled trials suggested that consciousness was not bound to the body, that information could be accessed non-locally, that the fundamental nature of intelligence itself was more fluid than anyone had previously imagined. The implications were staggering. If human awareness could extend beyond physical limits, intelligence gathering would no longer require surveillance or infiltration. The mind itself could become the ultimate tool of espionage. At first, the agency viewed Gateway as a revolutionary intelligence asset. Remote viewers sketched foreign military installations they had never physically seen. Operatives described classified meetings they had never attended. The results weren't perfect, but they were consistent enough to be impossible to ignore. Some subjects failed completely. Others displayed perception so precise it defied explanation. The implications stretched beyond intelligence and into the realm of existential crisis. This was where the program unraveled. The CIA had assumed that consciousness could be weaponized like any other tool. But Gateway defied control. The deeper subjects went, the more unpredictable the results became. Some found themselves unable to function in ordinary reality. Some encountered phenomena that could not be explained by physics or psychology. Others returned with information so unorthodox that it threatened to fracture the agency's rigid understanding of the world itself. The problem was triadic. The CIA needed three things for Gateway to work: repeatability, control, and secrecy. They got the first, but lost the others. The experiences were too dependent on the individual's mental and emotional state, making them impossible to standardize. Control was lost the moment operatives began experiencing personal revelations that conflicted with their missions. Secrecy shattered when it became clear that some of those who had undergone the training no longer aligned with the agency's goals. Unlike surveillance, unlike hacking, unlike psychological warfare, this was a system that refused to be contained. So the CIA did what it does best. It classified the research, buried the results, and walked away. Officially, the program was deemed inconclusive. But the truth was far more troubling. The program hadn't been abandoned because it failed. It had been abandoned because it worked too well, in ways that intelligence agencies were not prepared to understand. For decades, Gateway was left to gather dust, a relic of an intelligence age that had veered too close to something unknowable. But now, someone new has set their sights on it, not a spy master, not a government operative, but a man who sees no limits. A man who believes the problem with Gateway was not that it worked too well, but that it wasn't efficient enough. Musk has never been interested in secrets, only in systems. He does not hoard information like a spy master, nor does he deal in whispers, blackmail, or the quiet arts of deception. His genius, his entire mode of operation, is one of disruption. When he looks at a problem, he does not ask who controls this. He asks, why hasn't this been optimized yet? And to him, consciousness is just another inefficiency waiting to be solved. Where intelligence agencies saw human perception as a tool for espionage, Musk sees it as a technology problem. Meditation, training, discipline, these are slow, imprecise, biologically constrained. If a monk spends decades reaching enlightenment, that is not a mystical process to be revered, that is a bottleneck to be eliminated. The mind, he believes, is a machine, and machines can be upgraded. This is the engineer's delusion. The belief that all complexity can be tamed, all mysteries reduced to data, all human experience optimized into something faster, smoother, and more efficient. Musk does not see consciousness as something sacred, nor as something wild and uncontrollable. He sees it as a system waiting to be streamlined. And unlike the CIA, which abandoned Gateway when it became too unpredictable, he believes he can succeed where the government failed. Not through espionage, not through mind control, but through technology. Neuralink will replace the monk. No need for practice, patience, or struggle. A chip will bring instant enlightenment. Perception will be programmable. No unpredictable mystical experiences, just controlled, digitized, altered states. The mind will be fully integrated into the machine, thought and memory no longer private, but networked, optimized, upgraded. This is Musk's vision. The final merger of man and machine, where the inefficiencies of human cognition are erased and consciousness itself is brought under the domain of engineering. But this is where he miscalculates. Gateway failed as an intelligence tool because it depended on the individual. The results were inconsistent because they were deeply personal, shaped by the subject's emotions, beliefs, and moral foundation. The CIA wanted control. Instead, it encountered something that could not be tamed. The deeper operatives went, the less predictable their experiences became. Some found themselves broken, unable to function in ordinary reality. Others returned with perceptions so transformed that they no longer aligned with their original missions. The same triadic failure will break Musk's vision. only this time it will happen on a far greater scale. His first mistake is the illusion of automation. He believes consciousness can be streamlined like software, that enlightenment can be achieved through direct neural stimulation. But altered states are not merely neurological shifts. They are narratives, lived experiences that unfold in ways that cannot be standardized or automated. A machine may be able to induce the patterns of deep meditation, but it cannot reproduce the meaning that arises from struggle, self-discovery, and time. His second mistake is the error of standardization. Enlightenment is not a product that can be mass-produced. Every culture, every mystic tradition, every seeker has arrived at the same truth. Awakening is personal. No two people experience it the same way. The idea that a Neuralink chip could create the same altered state in every user is not just wrong, it is a fundamental misunderstanding of what consciousness is. His final and most dangerous mistake is the hubris of control. He assumes that because he understands how the brain works, he understands the soul. But consciousness is not a circuit. It is not a mere collection of electrical impulses waiting to be optimized. The very act of seeking altered states changes the one who seeks them. The human mind is not just a processor of information, it is an interpreter, a storyteller, a creator of meaning. Musk can generate the experience of transcendence, but he cannot give it meaning, and without meaning, altered states become nothing more than digital hallucinations. Every civilization that has sought the deeper truths of consciousness, every school of mysticism, every esoteric tradition, every lineage of wisdom has arrived at the same fundamental structure. Though their methods differed, their languages diverged, and their metaphors reflected their times, they all pointed to a triadic foundation: enlightenment, true perception, expanded awareness. Whatever name it has taken, the process has always rested on three pillars: practice, intellectual understanding, and moral development. This is not a belief system, it is not a cultural artifact. It is the structure underlying all human attempts to transcend ordinary consciousness. And where one of these elements is absent, the path collapses. Not into enlightenment, but into negation. The first pillar is practice. Consciousness is not a passive phenomenon, it is a skill. Altered states do not merely happen, they must be trained, refined, stabilized. Every serious tradition has understood this. The Tibetan monk does not meditate for decades as a performance. The Sufi does not whirl for mere theatrics. The Taoist does not cultivate breath simply to relax. These are disciplines rigorously developed over time because the expansion of perception is not a casual process. The mind must be conditioned to hold its shape when reality bends. Without this foundation, deep states of awareness become unstable, ungrounded, and ultimately dangerous. The second pillar is intellectual understanding. It is not enough to perceive, one must also interpret. The mind, when left unchecked, is a trickster. It sees patterns where there are none, imposes meaning where meaning does not exist, confuses intuition with fantasy. The untrained mind, when exposed to altered states, does not find truth. It finds delusion. This is why every serious spiritual discipline is paired with a rigorous intellectual framework. The Zen practitioner has the koan, the Kabbalist has the Sephirot, the alchemist has the emerald tablet. These are not constraints, they are maps designed to prevent the seeker from becoming lost in the labyrinth of their own consciousness. Without this structure, altered states do not lead to wisdom. They lead to deception, self-delusion, and madness. The third pillar is moral development. This is the most overlooked and the most dangerous to ignore. The expansion of perception is not neutral. It is not simply an increase in knowledge, it is an increase in power. And power, if not grounded in moral clarity, leads only to corruption. This is why the true masters of consciousness, those who reached the greatest heights, were never conquerors, never tyrants, never men who sought dominion over others. The Buddha did not build an empire. Rumi did not raise an army. Laozi did not engineer a kingdom. Power without wisdom becomes control, and control is the opposite of enlightenment. Without morality, altered states are not tools of liberation. They are tools of enslavement. This is why Musk's vision, his belief that enlightenment can be programmed, downloaded and automated, is doomed to failure. The three pillars are not optional. They are necessary conditions. Neuralink can induce the brain states of meditation, but it cannot train the mind to hold them. It can generate visions, but it cannot teach one how to interpret them. It can expand perception, but it cannot ensure that expansion leads anywhere meaningful. And without these safeguards, what Musk is creating is not transcendence, it is an illusion of transcendence. A hacked consciousness is not an enlightened consciousness. The former is an expansion of sensation. The latter is an expansion of being. The two are not the same, and the failure to understand that difference is the failure to understand consciousness itself. Musk believes he can create enlightenment without the journey, perception without interpretation, power without responsibility. In doing so, he commits the same error that has shattered minds throughout history. He removes the context that gives transcendence meaning. This is not speculation. We have already seen what happens when altered states emerge in societies that do not have the frameworks to hold them. The anthropologist and filmmaker Phil Borges spent years documenting how different cultures engage with what the West would call mystical experiences. Among the shamans, monks, and medicine people of indigenous traditions, there is an unbroken lineage of knowledge, an understanding of how to navigate altered states safely and integrate them into a meaningful life. In those societies, when a young person begins experiencing visions, hearing voices, or sensing realities beyond the ordinary, they are not discarded, pathologized, or sedated. They are guided, they are taught. Their experience is interpreted, given structure, and placed within a larger cultural context that supports their transformation. In the West, that scaffolding does not exist. A person experiencing the same visions in an industrialized society has no framework, no guide, no lineage to rely upon. Where an indigenous shaman might be trained for years to channel their experiences into wisdom and healing, a Western mind, untrained and ungrounded, is left alone with the raw intensity of perception unfiltered by structure. The results are not enlightenment. They are breakdown, fragmentation, psychosis. What could have been transformation instead becomes mental collapse, not because the experience itself was inherently destructive, but because there was no cultural system in place to shape it into something meaningful. This is exactly what Musk fails to understand. By removing the intellectual and ethical dimensions of transcendence, he is not engineering an advanced consciousness. He is mass-producing an experience that, stripped of context, will lead to dissociation and destabilization on a planetary scale. The first effect of this negation is perceptual collapse. When the mind is exposed to vast, unstructured, altered states, it does not automatically reach higher understanding. It flails. Without guidance, without discipline, without a map, it begins to impose its own meanings, often shaped by personal fears, unresolved traumas, and collective anxieties. In the absence of an interpretive framework, altered perception becomes not an expansion of wisdom, but a multiplication of delusions. The second effect is ethical erosion. In a traditional enlightenment process, moral grounding is a necessary part of the journey. Power is earned through discipline and tempered by responsibility. But when transcendence is sold as a product, it is stripped of its ethical core. The user receives all the intensity of expanded perception with none of the preparation to handle it. And worse, this altered state is not their own, not a deeply personal awakening, but a pre-packaged experience generated by an external system. This is not enlightenment, this is conditioning, a consciousness shaped not by wisdom, but by whoever owns the machine. The third and final effect is the severing of human sovereignty. The traditions that once guided consciousness, Buddhism, Sufism, Hermeticism, were not just systems of knowledge, they were systems of protection. They ensured that power was never placed in the hands of those who would abuse it. But a technological enlightenment, one engineered by corporate interests, does not protect. It does not teach, it does not prepare. It simply sells. And when transcendence becomes a commodity, it is no longer transcendence at all. It is a product to be consumed, controlled, and ultimately weaponized. Musk does not see this. He believes he is optimizing consciousness, but in truth he is unraveling it. He is not creating a new enlightenment, he is mass-producing psychosis. A civilization severed from its own interpretive traditions, flooded with artificially induced altered states, shaped not by self-discovery but by a corporate algorithm. This is not evolution. It is the hollowing out of the human mind itself. And once that process begins, it will not be easy to stop. Let's envision how it all plays out. The first generation of Neuralink initiates experiences the promised transcendence. The chip stimulates their neural pathways, inducing states that once took monks years to achieve. The technology works. The mind opens. Sensory input sharpens. The floodgates of perception part effortlessly, and for a moment they believe. But something is missing. At first, the experience is exhilarating. Users report heightened awareness, euphoric clarity, a sense of unity with something greater than themselves. But there is no struggle, no process of transformation. The altered states come too easily, and without the years of discipline that would have built the inner scaffolding to hold them. The mind does not know what to do with them. The effects begin to shift. Perception fragments. Thoughts become recursive. The raw influx of unfiltered consciousness turns inward, feeding on itself. Without a guiding framework, the altered states become unstable. Then comes the fear. In traditional mystical training, the seeker is prepared for this. They are warned that as consciousness expands, it does not only reveal light, it also reveals shadow. The hidden fears, the unresolved traumas, the suppressed fragments of the self, these all emerge when the mind extends beyond its ordinary limits. This is why spiritual traditions have always emphasized discipline, wisdom, and moral clarity. Without them, the expansion of perception does not lead to enlightenment. It leads to dissociation, breakdown, and collapse. The Neuralink users have no such preparation. At first, they try to control it manually, adjusting inputs, altering frequencies, recalibrating the experience. But the more they try to fix it, the more they entangle themselves in it. Like a dreamer becoming lucid in a nightmare, they struggle to wake up, only to find that there is no waking up, only deeper levels of recursive perception, each more detached from ordinary reality than the last. The technology was supposed to eliminate uncertainty. Instead, it has introduced an infinite loop of manufactured experiences with no fixed point of reference. And so, one by one, they submit. The only way to function is to let the machine take over, to relinquish agency, to allow the algorithm to filter perception, to guide consciousness, to override the self's failing ability to navigate its own awareness. Those who resist spiral into cognitive instability, unable to distinguish between genuine perception and system-generated hallucination. Those who surrender remain functional, but only as extensions of the system itself. Their enlightenment is no longer their own. Their thoughts are not their own. Their minds are no longer human minds, but nodes in a network, optimized for stability at the cost of sovereignty. And so the Neuralink priesthood is born. It begins as an elite caste, those who have undergone the transformation and now exist in an altered state of cognition, a realm of pure logic and optimized thought. They preach the death of human inconsistency, the obsolescence of suffering, the perfection of integrated consciousness. To the outside world, they are visionaries, pioneers, the first to break free from the limitations of the biological mind. But among themselves, they know the truth. They have lost something they cannot name. They can no longer remember what unaltered perception feels like. They cannot experience the world without the filter of the system. And in the quiet moments when the machine is silent, they feel it. The abyss of detachment, the infinite recursion of a mind that no longer belongs to itself. The final barrier between human and machine is not a technological one, it is a philosophical one. Once the act of perception itself is mediated by an external force, there is no self left to resist. What began as an enhancement ends as subjugation, not by force, but by necessity. The system has become their anchor. The algorithm has become their master. And beyond them, outside their enclosed network of optimized cognition, the rest of humanity watches, some in awe, some in horror, some in line, waiting for their turn. This is where we stand. Not in the distant future, not in some hypothetical world where the Neuralink priesthood already reigns, but here now at the threshold of decision. The process has not yet completed itself. The system is not yet absolute. The final form of human consciousness has not yet been written. But the paths have been laid. On one path, Musk's vision advances unchecked. Transcendence becomes a product. Altered states become a commodity. The mind ceases to be an organic experience and instead becomes an engineered construct, maintained and mediated by the machine. Free thought is not taken by force. It is surrendered for the sake of convenience, for the illusion of mastery, for the promise of a frictionless existence. On another path, the last remnants of the old order tighten their grip. Governments, seeing the collapse of intelligence as a proprietary force, scramble to reclaim control. They do not fight to stop Neuralink. They fight to own it, to shape it into a tool of their own making, to pull the system under their rule. The battle is not between freedom and control, but between rival systems of control. Whether by corporate optimization or state governance, consciousness remains something to be ruled rather than something to be liberated. But there is a third path, the one that has not yet been fully formed but that exists in potential. The path of those who reject both dominion and automation, who refuse to let perception itself be dictated by the hands of the powerful, whether they wear the face of government, of corporation, or of algorithm. This is the path that has always existed in the margins, carried by those who have sought wisdom outside of institutions, who have understood that true expansion of mind is not something that can be sold, nor something that can be taken. This is the divergence point. What happens next is not inevitable. It is a choice. If we continue forward without resistance, without awareness, without the understanding that the very nature of human perception is being rewritten before our eyes, then we will wake up in a world where our minds are no longer our own, not because they were taken, but because we allowed them to be redesigned into something else entirely. But if we resist, not with force but with will, if we refuse to let our consciousness be dictated by those who see it as an instrument rather than a birthright, then another future is possible. A future where perception remains free, where altered states remain a journey rather than a download, where the final frontier of human experience is not enclosed within a system but open to those who seek it by their own means. The last war is not in the future. It is now. And it is not a war of weapons, nor of governments, nor of economies. It is a war for the sovereignty of the human mind itself.